The morning sun spilled golden light over the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where roses climbed over white fences and gossip traveled faster than the postman. It was the day of the annual garden party, an event that every villager anticipated, not only for its tea and scones, but for the chance to observe, whisper, and judge. Miss Jane Marple, now in her late 70s, stood by her window with a small smile. She could see the flutter of bunting, hear the distant laughter of the vicar's wife, and smell the faint trace of freshly baked tarts. Her garden was immaculate, as always, but she was far more interested in the people than the flowers. "It's never the petals that tell the story," she murmured softly. "It's the footprints around them." At precisely 3 o'clock, the garden party began. Tables lined with lace cloths held trays of sandwiches, cakes, and cucumber rolls. The air buzzed with laughter and polite chatter. But beneath the pleasantness, Miss Marple sensed something amiss. At the center of attention was Colonel Arthur Pemberton, a retired military man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive ego. He had recently inherited Greenways Manor, the largest estate in the area. His arrival had stirred quite the conversation, especially when he hired a young secretary, Miss Clara Evans, barely 22, who seemed far too beautiful and far too clever for her own good. Miss Marple sat quietly under a maple tree sipping her tea. She observed, as she always did, every gesture, every glance, every uncomfortable silence. Colonel Pemberton boasted loudly about his war medals, while his secretary smiled politely, her eyes darting nervously whenever his wife, Lady Edith Pemberton, came near. Jealousy, Miss Marple thought. A most dangerous seed once planted. Just then, a strange sound interrupted the laughter, a sharp cry. The music stopped. The guests turned. At the far end of the garden near the rose bushes, Lady Pemberton stood motionless, her face pale as marble. Colonel Pemberton lay sprawled on the grass, dead. A hush fell over the garden. The teacups trembled in nervous hands. Someone screamed. Someone fainted. And amidst the chaos, Miss Marple simply closed her parasol, rose from her chair, and began to walk toward the scene. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, looking both harassed and bewildered. He had worked with Miss Marple before and had learned, sometimes painfully, that her intuition was sharper than any detective's notebook. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted. "I suppose you've already made up your mind who did it." "Oh, heavens, no," she said mildly. "I've merely observed that most of the people here have something to hide. And one of them, I suspect, something deadly." The doctor examined the body. "Poison," he concluded. "Fast-acting. In his tea," Craddock frowned. "Tea served to everyone." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but not everyone took sugar." She pointed to the table. A small silver sugar bowl sat beside the teapot, and beside it a tiny spoon with a faint residue of white powder. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "You see, Inspector," she continued, "a good hostess never lets her guests add sugar themselves unless she wishes to appear casual, or conceal something. I'd wager the poison was placed there deliberately." Craddock sighed. "And who would have the chance?" Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the group of guests. Lady Pemberton, trembling with shock, Miss Clara Evans, pale but composed, the vicar's wife whispering furiously, and Mr. Green, the banker, whose face was oddly expressionless. "Opportunity," Miss Marple mused. "It's a curious thing. It's often shared among many. But motive is unique." That evening, the village was buzzing. Rumors spread faster than the wind. Some said Lady Pemberton killed her husband out of jealousy. Others whispered that Clara Evans had been dismissed that very morning, a possible revenge. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat knitting by her fireplace, a cup of chamomile tea beside her. She had spoken to the maid at Greenways earlier, a nervous girl named Elsie, who had mentioned something rather interesting. "There was a quarrel last night," Elsie had said, "between the Colonel and Mr. Green, something about money missing from the accounts. Money, love, reputation, all tangled threads in the tapestry of murder." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. She could almost see it. The sequence of small, seemingly unimportant details forming a pattern. She rose, fetched her coat, and stepped out into the misty night. At Greenways Manor, the study light was still on. Through the window she saw Clara Evans hunched over the desk, crying softly. Miss Marple tapped gently on the glass. The girl looked up, startled, then opened the window. "Oh, Miss Marple. I thought you were the police." "No, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "But sometimes I'm worse." Inside the study, papers were scattered across the desk. Letters, receipts, and one half-burnt document in the fireplace. "You shouldn't have tried to destroy that," Miss Marple said gently, pointing at the ashes. "It makes you look guilty, even if you aren't." Lara's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't kill him!" He was going to expose me for something I didn't do. He said money was missing. But I swear I only did what he told me. And what was that, exactly?" Clara hesitated. He asked me to move funds from one account to another. He said it was just temporary. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Aye. And when the truth came out, you would have taken the blame. Yes, that sounds like Colonel Pemberton. Clara bit her lip. Lady Pemberton found out. She confronted him this morning. She said she'd rather see him dead than disgraced. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Did she indeed? The next morning, Miss Marple invited Inspector Craddock for tea. I believe, she said calmly, pouring his cup, that the answer lies in the sugar. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You've solved it then? Almost. She smiled. The colonel took his tea with sugar. His wife did not. His secretary did not. But there is one person who always took sugar, Mr. Green, the banker. You think he was the target? Exactly. The poison was meant for him. But the colonel, being boastful as ever, swapped cups to impress Miss Evans. He said something gallant, I believe, about her sweet tooth. Craddock leaned back. So the killer, as the person who feared exposure of embezzlement, Mr. Green was blackmailing someone. And that someone slipped the poison into his sugar bowl, intending to silence him forever. But fate, as always, played its little trick. Craddock stared at her. Lady Pemberton. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Clara Evans had too much to lose. Lady Pemberton had too much pride. But Elsie, the maid, overheard everything. She was the one moving the funds under Clara's name, at the colonel's orders. And Mr. Green found out. Craddock blinked. The maid. A servant hears everything, Inspector. She thought killing Mr. Green would solve all her problems. She merely didn't expect her employer to steal the wrong cup. By evening, Elsie confessed. She had indeed poisoned the sugar meant for Mr. Green, terrified of being sent to prison for the colonel's crimes. The colonel's arrogance had sealed his own fate. At the next morning's breakfast, the village had already moved on to fresh gossip. The baker's daughter's engagement, the vicar's new sermon. But Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, feeding crumbs to the sparrows. Such a pity, she sighed. One never truly knows the evil growing in the most ordinary hearts. Her tea grew cold as she smiled faintly to herself. But then, she murmured, that's what makes life in St. Mary Mead so very interesting. The air in St. Mary Mead had barely settled after the shocking events of the garden party, when another strange occurrence stirred the quiet village once more. News traveled on whispering tongues, through the baker's shop, the post office, and finally, to Miss Marple's front gate. A priceless portrait had vanished from Greendale Hall, the estate of the reclusive Sir Reginald Baxter, a man as proud as he was secretive. Miss Marple heard the gossip from her dear friend Mrs. Price Ridley, who arrived in a state of great excitement, her hat askew and cheeks flushed with the thrill of scandal. Stolen, my dear Jane, in the dead of night. The portrait of Lady Eleanor Baxter. Gone. They say it's worth a fortune, painted by Gainsborough himself. Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. But money isn't always the reason behind theft, dear. Sometimes it's the face in the painting that matters more than the gold frame. A Greendale Hall stood at the edge of the village. A sprawling mansion with ivy climbing up its stone walls and windows that seemed to watch the world with suspicion. Sir Reginald, a widower in his 60s, had lived there with his niece Catherine and 2 servants, Mrs. Dobbs the housekeeper, and Thomas the young gardener. When Miss Marple arrived at the hall that afternoon, invited of course by Inspector Craddock, who had learned to seek her advice early, she found the great man pacing furiously in his study. It's an outrage, he barked. The portrait has hung in this room for over 100 years. My late wife's likeness, stolen under my very nose. Miss Marple's blue eyes wandered around the room. The empty space on the wall where the portrait had hung was like a wound. The edges of the wallpaper behind it were lighter than the rest, untouched by time. Beneath, a faint square of dust marked the absence. No sign of forced entry, she asked softly. Craddock shook his head. None. The windows were locked from inside, and the door bolted. Whoever did it had a key, or never left at all. Miss Marple nodded. Ah, then we are looking for a thief not from without, but from within. Catherine Baxter entered the room then, a slender young woman with delicate features and a sadness behind her eyes. She greeted Miss Marple politely, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. It's dreadful, she said quietly. That portrait meant everything to Uncle Reginald. It was all he had left of Aunt Eleanor. Miss Marple observed her carefully. You were fond of your aunt, I imagine? I adored her. She was kind, in ways my uncle could never be. There was a flicker of something in her expression, grief perhaps, or guilt. Miss Marple could not yet tell. Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, was a plump woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She insisted she had locked the drawing-room herself at 10 o'clock the night before. Not a soul went in or out, Miss Marple, that I can swear. Except for Mr. Thomas, maybe. He was in the garden late trimming the hedges. At 10 o'clock at night, Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Dobbs sniffed. His young miss. Young men do strange things. Thomas, when questioned, was nervous but respectful. He claimed to have seen a light flicker in the study window around midnight, but thought little of it. Thought it was Sir Reginald working late again, he muttered. Didn't want to get scolded, so I went home. Miss Marple glanced at Inspector Craddock. There's always a light, isn't there? Always someone awake when they shouldn't be. Later that evening, as the investigation dragged on, Miss Marple found herself once again in the study. She moved about quietly, her hands clasped before her, her eyes scanning every inch of the room, the desk, the carpet, the windowsill. Then she saw it. Something so small that anyone else might have missed it. A faint trace of paint dust on the carpet, pale blue and cream. She bent down and touched it lightly. How curious, she murmured. As if someone tried to move a painting through here, and forgot that dust leaves its own confession. She followed the trail, faint but visible, to the fireplace. The hearth was cold, yet the smell of turpentine hung faintly in the air. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Someone was cleaning something, she said softly, or perhaps repainting it. The next morning, Miss Marple returned with a small basket of muffins. See, an excuse as always. She asked to see the servants' quarters, just out of curiosity, she said in her most innocent tone. In Thomas's room she found a small easel, paintbrushes, and a half-finished landscape painting. You're quite the artist, she said kindly. Thomas flushed. Just a hobby, ma'am. And yet, she continued gently, the colors on your palette, Prussian blue, ivory white, are the very same shades from Lady Eleanor's portrait. He looked stricken. I didn't steal it. I swear! I only helped Miss Catherine move it. She said it needed cleaning. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah. So she moved it. And where might it be now, I wonder? When confronted, Catherine broke down. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she confessed the truth. I didn't mean to deceive anyone! The portrait wasn't stolen. I took it. I was trying to save it. Inspector Craddock frowned. Save it? From what? From my uncle, she whispered. He planned to sell it. It was my aunt's most precious possession, and he never loved her. He only loved the money she brought him. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers staring at her face for profit. Miss Marple nodded gently. And where did you hide it, my dear? Catherine hesitated, then led them up the narrow stairs to the attic. There, wrapped carefully in linen, stood the missing portrait. Untouched, though one corner bore faint smudges of fresh paint. Miss Marple examined it closely. Then she gasped. This isn't the original. Craddock blinked. What do you mean? Look closely, Inspector. The brushstrokes are crude in comparison, and the signature in the corner is wrong. This is a forgery. Catherine's eyes widened in horror. Then where's the real one? It took Miss Marple only a day to find out. She returned that evening, her knitting bag over her arm, and sat down with Sir Reginald by the fire. Sir Reginald, she said softly, I believe you've had that portrait insured, haven't you? The man stiffened. Naturally. It's worth £20,000. Oh, how practical? Miss Marple said pleasantly. And of course, a theft claim would double that value, wouldn't it? His face turned red. What are you implying, madam? Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Merely that you commissioned a copy, replaced the original with it, and then staged the theft. You would collect the insurance and sell the real painting privately, a tidy profit. Craddock, listening nearby, gasped. But then how did Catherine get the copy? Miss Marple said softly, or dear Sir Reginald underestimated her. She thought she was protecting the real portrait, not realizing she had already been deceived. Sir Reginald's eyes darted toward the drawer in his desk. Miss Marple stood. Please don't, she said quietly. The original is already in safe hands. I sent Thomas to fetch it from your shed this morning, where you hid it under a tarpaulin. A rather poor hiding place, if I may say so. The old man sagged back in his chair, defeated. You clever devil, he muttered. Miss Marple only smiled. Oh no, Sir Reginald. I'm merely a foolish old woman who pays attention. When the case was closed and the rightful painting returned to the Baxter family, Inspector Craddock met Miss Marple in her garden. You know, ma'am, he said, sipping his tea, you make this job both easier and more difficult at the same time. She chuckled. Life, Inspector, is rather like a portrait. One must stand far enough away to see the truth, and close enough to notice the lies. He grinned. And you always seem to manage both. Miss Marple smiled modestly, turning back to her knitting. Only because people, dear Inspector, are far more revealing than they imagine. Paintings merely capture their faces, not their secrets. The spring air in St. Mary Mead was sweet with the scent of lilacs, and the church bells chimed cheerfully across the village square. To most people, it was a perfectly ordinary afternoon, but in St. Mary Mead, ordinary was merely the calm before another storm. Miss Marple sat by her garden window, embroidering a handkerchief when she received the vicar's wife's note. "My dear Jane, do come to our little tea this afternoon. The bishop is visiting, and I promise the conversation shall be divine." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Divine conversation? She murmured, so often followed by devilish deeds. By 4 o'clock, she had put on her best hat, a blue one with a single white rose, and made her way to the vicarage. The tea party was already underway. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Granger, was fluttering about like an anxious bird, ensuring every cup was full and every guest complimented her lemon sponge. The Bishop of Wessex, a dignified man with kind eyes, sat chatting with the local magistrate, Mr. Harold Simmons, while a few of the village ladies whispered in corners. Among them were Mrs. Price Ridley, Colonel Melrose, and the ever-dramatic Miss Hartnell, who had recently declared that crime follows Miss Marple like a shadow. Miss Marple, unbothered, poured herself tea and quietly observed. The atmosphere was light, but something, as always, felt off. A tension beneath the laughter. A nervousness in the eyes of certain guests. "My dear," Mrs. Granger said, sitting beside her, "I must tell you. The bishop's visit isn't merely social. He's inspecting the old church renovations. There's talk of missing funds from the donation box. Terribly embarrassing, you know." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Oh dear. The Lord may forgive easily, but the church accountant seldom does." As tea was served, a sudden commotion broke the chatter. Mr. Harold Simmons, the magistrate, choked violently, clutching his throat. His teacup fell shattering across the table. Within seconds, he slumped in his chair, motionless. Gasp filled the room. The bishop sprang to his feet, horrified. Mrs. Granger screamed. Someone called for the doctor, but it was far too late. Miss Marple set her cup down calmly. Her eyes had already moved to the tea tray. "No need to hurry," she said softly. "Is beyond earthly help." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, the once cheerful vicarage was cloaked in dread. "Poison again," the doctor declared grimly. "Fast acting. Slipped into his tea." Craddock turned to Miss Marple with a half-resigned sigh. "You wouldn't happen to have any theories yet, would you, ma'am?" "Only that Mr. Simmons wasn't the intended victim," she said, folding her hands neatly. "But he was, as usual, in the wrong place at the wrong time." Craddock frowned. "You think the poison was meant for someone else?" "Undoubtedly," said Miss Marple. "And I suspect the intended target was sitting rather close to him. The bishop himself." A murmur went through the room. The bishop looked pale. "But why would anyone wish me harm?" he asked, bewildered. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Oh, my dear bishop, good men make dangerous enemies, often among those who serve closest to them." The investigation began. Mrs. Granger, trembling, confessed she had prepared the tea herself, but her maid Lucy had served it. Lucy, a timid young woman of 20, swore she hadn't touched the cups except to carry them. Miss Marple examined the tea set. 6 cups, 1 shattered. 2 of them still half full. 1 held a faint bitter smell. She bent closer and sniffed gently. "Almonds?" she murmured. "Always almonds. A hint of cyanide, so very classic." Craddock nodded. "Someone slipped poison into the bishop's cup before it was poured." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "After. Which means the culprit was here, and knew precisely which cup was his." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her cozy parlor with a single lamp burning. The pieces of the puzzle were forming, but the picture was not yet clear. She recalled every detail: the bishop's calm composure, the magistrate's seat, changed at the last moment when Mrs. Granger insisted on a better view of the roses, the nervous glance Lucy gave to Mrs. Granger just before serving the tea. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, the pattern is quite familiar." She took her shawl, left her cottage, and walked quietly to the churchyard. The moonlight fell softly across the graves, and the tall spire loomed above. From the vestry she heard the faint rustle of movement. Inside, Mrs. Granger stood beside the open donation box, clutching a handful of envelopes. "Oh," she gasped, dropping them at the sight of Miss Marple. "I was just checking the collections." 8 midnight. Miss Marple asked kindly, "Your most devoted?" The vicar's wife's face went white. Within an hour Miss Marple had pieced it all together, every deceit, every misdirection. The next morning, she invited Inspector Craddock for tea and laid out the facts as neatly as a knitting pattern. "You see, Inspector," she began, "the missing church funds were never stolen by an outsider. They were taken gradually by Mrs. Granger herself, for her husband's medical bills, I suspect. A foolish but desperate act." Craddock blinked. "Then what about the murder?" When the bishop announced his surprise audit of the church accounts, Mrs. Granger panicked. She planned to poison his tea. A swift, quiet solution before exposure. Craddock frowned. "But how did the magistrate end up dead?" The simplest tragedy of all, a last-minute change of seats. Mrs. Granger switched their cups when she fussed over the tablecloth, never realizing that her hand of salvation had doomed another instead. A Craddock let out a low whistle. So she killed the magistrate by accident. Miss Marple nodded sadly. Indeed. The Lord may forgive her, but I doubt she'll ever forgive herself. By the following day Mrs. Granger confessed. She wept as she spoke of guilt and fear, of the temptation to conceal one's sin with another. Her husband, the vicar, broke down beside her, his faith shaken but his love unchanged. The bishop forgave her in a trembling voice, calling it the gravest sin born of the purest desperation. When it was over, Miss Marple quietly slipped away, returning to her roses and her solitude. That evening, as she sat by her fire, the cat purring at her feet, she reflected gently. "It's so very human," she whispered, "to believe small wrongs can be hidden under good intentions. But evil, like poison in tea, always finds its way to the surface." The clock ticked softly. Outside, the church bells told the hour, solemn, steady, and strangely peaceful. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Well," she murmured, "I dare say the next sermon shall be rather more honest than usual." The summer sun rose lazily over St. Mary Mead, casting long golden shadows across the cobbled lanes. The air was unusually still, the kind of morning when even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table, noticed it at once. "There's something unnatural about silence," she murmured, stirring her tea. "It often precedes discovery, and not the pleasant sort." At precisely 8:30, the peace shattered with a frantic knock on her door. It was Tom Larkin, the local postman, red-faced and gasping. "Miss Marple, old Mr. Henderson's been found dead." Miss Marple set down her teacup, unruffled. She said softly. "I wondered when that would happen." "You what?" Tom stammered. "The man's been acting nervous for weeks," she said gently. "And I did notice his clock stopped yesterday. A curious omen." Mr. George Henderson was one of St. Mary Mead's oldest residents, a retired watchmaker known for his precision and punctuality. His house, a neat brick cottage near the green, was a shrine to order, shelves of timepieces, each ticking in perfect rhythm. But when Miss Marple arrived, led by Inspector Craddock, that rhythm was gone. The air inside was thick and strange, filled with the faint scent of oil and dust. Mr. Henderson sat slumped in his armchair, spectacles askew, his hand resting near a small brass clock that had fallen to the floor. Its glass face was shattered, the hands frozen at 11:47. Craddock sighed. "Doctor says it's heart failure, but I don't buy it." Man was as strong as an ox. Miss Marple bent down, examining the clock. You see, Inspector, time is rarely truthful in a murder scene. It can be made to lie quite convincingly." Craddock frowned. "You think someone staged this?" She gave a small smile. "Let's not jump ahead. But tell me, who found him?" "His housekeeper, Mrs. Webb, said she came in this morning as usual and found him like this." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Webb. She's rather fond of her late husband, isn't she, though she's been widowed 10 years. Craddock blinked. "You know everything, don't you?" "Not everything, Inspector. Only what people try too hard to hide." The village was buzzing by noon. Some said Mr. Henderson had enemies. Others said he'd been blackmailing someone. The man had a habit of listening more than he should, and in a small village, that could be dangerous. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the clock. She visited Henderson's workshop, a small back room filled with hundreds of ticking watches. On the workbench lay a repaired Mantel clock and a note in neat handwriting. "Meet me tonight at 11:45. Bring the letter." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "So that explains the time." She showed the note to Craddock, who scowled. The murderer staged the scene to match the message, to make it look like he died naturally during the meeting. "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured. "And if I'm not mistaken, the missing letter mentioned here is the reason he died." That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, a stout woman with a nervous habit of twisting her apron. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said tearfully. "I came in and there he was, sitting as if asleep." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a shelf behind her. "You've kept the clocks running, I see. Except that one." Mrs. Webb followed her eyes to a dusty clock with a broken spring. "Oh, that one's been dead for months. Curious," said Miss Marple softly. "You see, Mrs. Webb, I've always found that people who live among clocks develop a sort of sensitivity to time. When one stops, it often means something." The woman swallowed hard. "You don't think?" "I think, my dear, that Mr. Henderson may have discovered something he shouldn't have. Perhaps about you, or someone close to you." Webb's lips trembled. "I swear, I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "But you know who did." That night Miss Marple couldn't sleep. The ticking of her own mantel clock felt louder than usual, marking time like a whispering reminder. She sat in her chair knitting until midnight, then stood abruptly. "Yes," she said softly. "That's it. 11:45. Not for him, but for her." The next morning, she walked straight to the vicarage where Arthur Webb, Mrs. Webb's son, worked as the handyman, a quiet, handsome young man, polite but distant. "Arthur," she said gently, "were you at Mr. Henderson's house last night?" He froze. "Why would I be?" "Because your mother said you weren't." "Which is precisely why I think you were." He looked at her, startled. "You've got no proof." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "No proof, only reason. Mr. Henderson lent you money years ago to start your mechanic shop, didn't he? And he recently asked you to repay it, or else he'd tell the vicar you were falsifying accounts." Arthur's eyes darkened. "He was blackmailing me." "So you arranged to meet him at 11:45, she continued. "You argued, you pushed him, only lightly perhaps, but he fell." The shock stopped his heart. Arthur's jaw clenched. "He was going to ruin my life." "And so," Miss Marple said quietly, "you staged the clock to make it look like an accident." There was silence. The young man's hands shook. "I didn't mean to kill him." "I know," she said softly, "but time, like truth, can't be stopped forever." Later, at the police station, Arthur confessed everything. The note had been his. He had gone to beg for more time to repay his debt. When Henderson refused, the argument turned fatal by chance. Inspector Craddock looked grim as he filed the report. "You seem to have a sixth sense for guilt, Miss Marple." "No, Inspector," she replied. "I merely know that guilt and time are the only things one can't mend, not even a watchmaker." That evening, St. Mary Mead was quiet again. Miss Marple sat by her window, the sunset glowing through the lace curtains. She wound her own clock carefully, listening to its steady tick. "Time keeps all our secrets," she said to herself, "until someone listens closely enough." The clock chimed softly 5. Miss Marple smiled. "A pity," she whispered, "that Mr. Henderson's clocks couldn't warn him of the one moment that mattered most." The Rosewood Inn stood on the edge of Much Benham, a small village a few miles from St. Mary Mead. It was a charming ivy-covered place with a reputation for warm scones, gossip-laden breakfasts, and secrets whispered over teacups. To the casual visitor it looked like the picture of peace. To Miss Jane Marple, however, peace was often the perfect disguise for wickedness. She arrived on a foggy Tuesday morning, invited by her old friend Colonel Arthur Melrose, who had written in a rather troubled hand, "My dear Miss Marple, a peculiar thing has happened at the Rosewood Inn. A guest has died suddenly, and though everyone insists it was natural, I am not convinced. Your discerning eye would be invaluable." A never one to refuse a puzzle, Miss Marple packed her best hat, her knitting bag, and took the morning train. By the time she reached the inn, the mist had settled thickly over the village green, and the scent of roses hung in the damp air. Inside, the Rosewood Inn was as cozy as ever. A fire crackling in the hearth, the faint clink of china, and Mrs. Ivy Prentice, the innkeeper, bustling about with her usual energy. She was a plump woman with rosy cheeks, the sort who smiled with her mouth but rarely with her eyes. "Welcome, Miss Marple. The Colonel said you were coming. Dreadful business, that poor gentleman dying in his sleep." Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "Yes, the unfortunate Mr. Alastair Green, wasn't it?" "That's right. Came 2 nights ago. Said he wanted peace and quiet. Next morning found dead in his bed. Doctor said heart failure. And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "Colonel Melrose doesn't believe it." Mrs. Prentice gave a tight smile. "The Colonel sees mystery everywhere, bless him." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "As do I, my dear, though sometimes mystery hides in the plainest teapot." Colonel Melrose greeted her warmly in the small lounge. "You came, thank heaven. There's something not right about Green's death. The man looked fit as a fiddle last night at dinner. Then, gone." Miss Marple seated herself by the window, knitting in hand. "Tell me everything, Colonel. Who was present last evening?" Melrose began listing them. "Mr. Alastair Green, the victim, a retired solicitor from London. Mrs. Prentice, the innkeeper. Mr. Harold Quince, a nervous traveling salesman. Miss Violet Drummond, a quiet schoolteacher. Captain Derek Shaw, a charming man with 2 perfect manners." They had all dined together, chatted politely, then gone to their rooms. The next morning, Green was found lifeless, no sign of struggle, nothing stolen. "And his personal effects?" Miss Marple asked. "Still there, except one odd thing. The inn's guestbook." "The guestbook?" "Yes." Someone tore out a page, the very one where Green signed his name. Miss Marple's needles stopped mid-stitch. How curious. The dead seldom care about anonymity, but the living sometimes care very much indeed. That evening Miss Marple requested to see Mr. Green's room. Mrs. Prentice hesitated but obliged. The room was simple. lace curtains, a mahogany dresser, a single candle on the nightstand. The bed was neatly remade, though Miss Marple suspected every wrinkle held a story. She examined the bedside table. A glass of water stood half drunk. A book lay open, the essays of Francis Bacon, and beside it a small bottle labeled sleeping drops. Two before bed. Who provided these drops? She asked quietly. Mrs. Prentice fidgeted. Oh, he brought them himself. Said he had trouble sleeping. Did he indeed? Miss Marple murmured. She picked up the bottle. It was almost full. Then he must have been a frugal sleeper. In the dim light, she noticed something strange. A faint oily residue on the rim of the glass. She dabbed it with her handkerchief, frowning. Oil of bitter almonds, she whispered. Cyanide. That night, as she sat by the fire knitting, Miss Marple pondered her suspects. Green had been a solicitor. Clever, discreet, and possibly dangerous to someone. But who? She recalled something Mrs. Prentice had said offhandedly during tea. Funny thing, Miss Marple, that Captain Shaw keeps asking when the police will return the guest book. Said he wanted to check his signature. Did he now? Miss Marple said thoughtfully. At that moment Mr. Harold Quince shuffled in, pale and twitching. I can't stand this waiting. The man's death, the questions. It's too much. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Perhaps a little honesty would lighten your nerves, Mr. Quince. Did you know Mr. Green before you arrived here? His eyes darted. No, I'd never met him. Then why? Miss Marple asked softly. Did you address him as Mr. Grant at dinner? He froze. It just slipped out. Slipped from memory, she corrected. Because that was his real name. Green was an alias. The salesman's face crumpled. I didn't kill him. I only knew he'd cheated my firm years ago. I came to warn him we'd found him again. Warn him or silence him? He shook his head violently. I swear. I left him alive? Miss Marple patted his arm gently. Then you needn't worry, Mr. Quince. The guilty rarely sleep as badly as they pretend. The next morning, Miss Marple asked for the guest ledger. The new page inserted after the torn one had smudges of ink. Recent, deliberate. At the corner of the page she found something faint, a partial imprint of another name pressed into the paper beneath. With a pencil, she shaded over it lightly until the ghost of a signature appeared. D. Shaw. Her eyes narrowed. Captain Derek Shaw, our man of charm. That evening Miss Marple asked all the guests to join her in the lounge, for a little remembrance of poor Mr. Green. Mrs. Prentice brought tea. The others gathered uneasily. Miss Marple began, her tone light. I always think the truth of a tragedy lies not in what people say, but in what they pretend to forget. Mr. Green, for instance, was not really Mr. Green at all. A gasp rippled through the room. He was a solicitor who once defended a certain Captain Derek Shaw, in a rather unfortunate embezzlement case. Shaw's smile faltered. I don't know what you're implying. Only that Green's letter, the one he received the night before he died, was from you, asking to meet him here to discuss your reputation. Miss Marple looked directly at him. You brought the sleeping drops, didn't you? You convinced him to take them, a cordial for old time's sake. Shaw's face turned pale. This is ridiculous. And then, she continued softly, you returned to his room later. Not to check on him, but to remove the page from the guest book that linked you both. Unfortunately for you, I found a trace of your signature impressed beneath the next page. The silence was heavy. Shaw's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, then stopped. He ruined my life, he muttered. He made sure I'd never work again. He deserved it. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently. But poison, Captain, is never the weapon of a gentleman. When Inspector Craddock arrived that night, Shaw was gone. They found him hours later at the edge of the moor, coat torn by brambles, trying to flee toward the coast road. He confessed quietly. The old solicitor had recognized him, threatened to expose him again, and in desperation, Shaw had slipped cyanide into his drink. Craddock shook his head as they took him away. If you hadn't noticed that guest book, Miss Marple, he'd have gotten clean away. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One learns to look for what's missing, Inspector, not what's there. In crime, as in embroidery, it's the empty spaces that reveal the pattern. That night, the Rosewood Inn was silent once more. Miss Marple sat by the window in her small room, watching fog roll across the garden. Somewhere below, Mrs. Prentice was locking up, humming faintly to herself. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and whispered to the night, Poor man, running from the past is rather like trying to run from time. One always ends up in the same place. The inn's clock struck midnight. Miss Marple set down her cup, folded her knitting and smiled. And another secret, she said softly, finally kept on time. It was one of those golden autumn mornings when St. Mary Mead looked too lovely to harbor anything wicked. The hedgerows shimmered with dew, and the air carried the faint, sweet scent of ripening apples. Miss Marple stood by her garden gate pruning shears in hand, admiring the neighbor's orchard that stretched beyond the lane. It belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Denham, newcomers from London. The sort of couple who wore city polish like a thin veneer over their uncertainty. So many apples, and yet not a single pie sent over. She murmured to herself with a wry smile. Always a sign of trouble brewing. Her thought was interrupted by a shrill cry from the orchard. A moment later, the young maid from the Denham household came running down the path, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple? Oh, miss, come quick! There's a man lying under the apple tree. I think he's dead." Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She dropped her shears, gathered her shawl, and hurried toward the orchard. The sight that greeted her was at once beautiful and horrifying. Beneath the grandest apple tree in the garden, its branches heavy with red fruit, lay a man's body, sprawled awkwardly on the grass. His face was turned toward the sky, eyes open and unseeing. A basket of apples lay overturned beside him. Mrs. Denham stood nearby, her gloved hands pressed to her mouth. He was helping with the picking. She stammered. "Our gardener, Mr. Collins. I thought he'd fainted, but—" Miss Marple knelt down, studying the man's still form. His lips were faintly blue, and there was a sweet, sharp scent lingering near his mouth. She looked around, noticing the apple basket, and one fruit with a small puncture mark on its skin. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I do hope no one else has been eating these." Inspector Craddock, summoned from town, arrived an hour later. He found Miss Marple still at the scene, calm as ever, her knitting bag by her side. "What have we this time, Miss Marple?" He sighed. "Poison, I rather fancy," she said softly, "but a curious sort. Something slipped into the fruit, perhaps, a local experiment gone wrong." The Craddock frowned. "And who'd poison an apple meant for the gardener?" Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "Perhaps it wasn't meant for him at all." The Denhams were an odd pair. Harold Denham, tall, confident, and fond of giving orders, had recently retired from a shipping firm. His wife Eleanor, quiet and delicate, rarely spoke unless spoken to. The villagers whispered that she'd been unhappy since arriving in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple paid her a call that evening, bringing a basket of her own roses. "I thought a little color might cheer you," she said kindly. Mrs. Denham managed a smile. "You're very thoughtful, Miss Marple. I can hardly believe what happened." "Terrible business," Miss Marple agreed, settling in. "Though I can't help feeling the poor gardener may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time." The younger woman looked startled. "What do you mean?" "Only that poison is a coward's weapon, my dear. It rarely reaches the intended target by accident." Mrs. Denham's teacup trembled. "I assure you, I know nothing of poison." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure you don't. But one always notices when someone is afraid, especially of their own garden." That night, Miss Marple couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the orchard under the moonlight. The apple tree where the man had died stood like a sentinel, its shadow long and still. Suddenly, movement caught her eye, a figure creeping among the trees, a lantern in hand. "Ah," she whispered. Curiosity after dark. Always a bad sign. She watched as the figure dug briefly at the base of the apple tree, then hurried back toward the house. At dawn, Miss Marple was already out walking, as was her custom. When Inspector Craddock arrived later, she was waiting for him by the gate. "Inspector," she said briskly, "you'll find something rather interesting buried beneath that apple tree." He blinked. "Buried? Less. A small metal box. I didn't touch it, of course." They unearthed it together, an old tobacco tin, its lid rusted but intact. Inside lay a folded letter and a small bottle labeled arsenic. Craddock whistled. "Good heavens. That settles the cause of death then." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but not the reason." The letter inside the tin was brief but damning. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Denham and Reed D. "You know what your husband did in London. If you won't pay, I'll tell everyone. Midnight by the orchard, or I go to the papers." See, Craddock looked grim. "So the gardener was blackmailing her. Or so we're meant to think," Miss Marple said softly. "But this letter wasn't buried by the person it accuses. It was planted, to shift suspicion." Craddock frowned. "Who'd do that?" "Someone clever. Someone who knows how guilt behaves, and how quickly a frightened woman might crumble under it." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple invited both Denhams for tea at her cottage. The air was tense. Mrs. Denham looked pale, while her husband seemed irritated by the entire ordeal. "I do hope," Miss Marple began pleasantly, "you're not finding village life too dull after London." Harold Denham snorted. "Dull? My dear lady, dullness is precisely what we wanted. Unfortunately, it seems safe. Mary Mead is full of amateur detectives." "How extraordinary," she said sweetly. "One might almost think you had something to hide." His eyes flashed. "If you're implying—" "Not at all," Miss Marple interrupted. only that it's rather unusual for arsenic to be kept in a household that claims to have no pests." There was a silence. Mrs. Denham looked at her husband in alarm. "Arsenic," she whispered. "Harold, you told me—" "Quiet, Eleanor," he snapped. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Aye, so she didn't know." That evening, Craddock confronted Denham with evidence Miss Marple had quietly gathered. The arsenic bottle, as it turned out, matched a purchase made under his name at a London chemist 6 months earlier, supposedly for rat poison. Under pressure, the story spilled out. Denham had embezzled funds from his shipping firm and framed a junior clerk, Charles Collins, the gardener who'd later tracked him down. Collins had threatened to expose him unless paid back. Denham invited him to the orchard to discuss terms, offering him a poisoned apple instead. When Collins collapsed, Denham panicked and buried the blackmail letter and poison tin to divert suspicion onto his wife, the one person who might not question him. "You killed him," Craddock said coldly. Denham sneered. "It was self-defense, against ruin." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of iron. "Murder is never self-defense, Mr. Denham. It is only the final confession of cowardice." A week later, the Denham house was shuttered. Mrs. Denham had gone to stay with relatives, pale but free. The villagers whispered, the orchard stood empty, and the apples slowly withered on the branch. Miss Marple meanwhile sat by her fire, reading the day's paper. The story of the orchard poisoner had already faded to a small column. She smiled faintly. "Strange," she mused, "how often evil hides beneath beauty. A perfect apple, a perfect smile, a perfect lie." Her cat purred at her feet. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the apple trees, scattering a few golden leaves against her window. "Poor man," she murmured. "If only he'd remembered what every gardener knows. The fruit you plant in deceit will always bear bitter harvest." The clock struck 9. Miss Marple folded her paper, set aside her knitting, and blew out the lamp. "And so," she whispered, "time prunes another branch." The church bells of St. Mary Mead rang bright and joyous that morning, echoing across the village green. The air smelled of lilies and excitement. A rare wedding day in a place where gossip usually served as the only form of entertainment. Everyone had turned up to witness the event. Miss Clara Whitmore, the young, beautiful bride, was marrying Mr. Julian Harrow, a man of good fortune and mysterious past. Even Miss Marple, though she rarely attended weddings these days, had accepted an invitation. She said it was useful to observe happiness. One learns so much from it. The ceremony went off perfectly. The bride, radiant in lace and pearls, blushed prettily as she took her vows. The groom looked handsome and calm, though his eyes flickered nervously now and again toward the rear pews. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the crowd cheered and rice flew through the air like white confetti snow. But by evening, the bride had vanished. The first sign of trouble came just as the wedding dinner was being served at the Harrow family estate on Maple Lane, a grand old manor surrounded by whispering beeches. The guests had just lifted their glasses for a toast when Mrs. Harrow, the groom's mother, gasped. "Julian, where is Clara? She went to change her gown over 20 minutes ago." The laughter died instantly. The music faltered. A few of the younger guests giggled nervously, until someone returned from upstairs, pale as parchment. "She's not in her room," the maid stammered. "Her dress is on the chair." "But she's gone." Julian Harrow turned white, then red. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" The maid held up a piece of paper found on the dressing table. It read, in shaky handwriting, "Forgive me. I can't go through with it. Don't look for me. C.W." A murmur ran through the guests. Mrs. Harrow fainted dead away, and in the corner, quietly sipping her tea, Miss Marple's blue eyes gleamed with curiosity. By the next morning, the entire village was in uproar. Some claimed the bride had run away with a secret lover. Others whispered that she discovered something dreadful about her new husband. The newspapers were already calling it the vanishing bride of Maple Lane. Inspector Craddock, though wary of small-town melodrama, arrived promptly, and was not at all surprised to find Miss Marple already at the Harrow estate, politely questioning the servants. "I might have known you'd be here," he said dryly. "You know me too well, Inspector," she replied sweetly. "And you know as well as I do that brides don't simply evaporate. Particularly not those with new jewelry and old secrets." Miss Marple began with the room itself. The dressing gown was on the chair, the wedding dress beautifully folded. On the vanity lay a small perfume bottle, a handkerchief, and a single white rose, its stem snapped cleanly in two. To most, it looked like carelessness. To Miss Marple, it screamed of struggle. "A woman in flight doesn't take time to break flowers," she murmured. "Unless she didn't flee willingly." There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints outside the French doors, and no carriage marks on the gravel road. Only the faint scent of lavender and something else. Something metallic, sharp, chloroform. she said softly, bending over the handkerchief. And not the sort one buys easily. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village shop, run by Mr. Pritchard, a man who prided himself on knowing everyone's business. "Such a to-do, Miss Marple," he said eagerly. "They say she left her poor husband without a word." "Indeed," she said mildly. "And yet, didn't I hear Mr. Harrow bought a rather large quantity of lavender oil just 2 days ago?" Pritchard blinked. "Why, yes. Said it was for the wedding. Wanted the house to smell fresh." "Quite thoughtful," she murmured. "Especially considering lavender hides certain other odors rather well." She left the shop smiling faintly, though her mind was troubled. If Julian Harrow had something to hide, the motive would be crucial. Love gone sour, money, or something buried deeper in his past. That evening, she paid a call on Mrs. Harrow, the groom's mother. A tall, imperious woman who had once ruled London society and never quite accepted that she now ruled only her servants. "It's disgraceful," Mrs. Harrow fumed. "That girl embarrassed my son before the entire county. We took her in out of charity, and this is how she repays us." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Charity, my dear lady, is so often mistaken for opportunity." The older woman sniffed. She was beneath him. "Pretty, yes, but poor. My son deserved better." "Perhaps he thought so too," Miss Marple said softly. "But I wonder, was he marrying her, or her inheritance?" Mrs. Harrow blinked. "Her inheritance." "Oh yes," Miss Marple nodded. "Her late uncle's estate in Devon, due to her upon marriage. Most fortunate timing, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Harrow's face paled. "How do you know these things?" "One reads the local papers, my dear," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea, "and one listens." That night, Inspector Craddock returned from London with news Clara's inheritance had indeed transferred automatically to her new husband, as stipulated in the will, unless her death were proven within a week of the wedding. Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet horror. "Then, my dear Inspector, we have less a disappearance than a deadline." At dawn, Miss Marple was already in the garden behind the Harrow estate, walking slowly, thoughtfully. She paused beneath the old maple tree that gave the lane its name. The ground was damp, and there were faint scuff marks leading toward the tool shed. Inside, it smelled of earth and oil. The floor was swept, yet a corner near the back showed signs of recent digging. And something else, a torn scrap of lace caught on a nail. "Oh dear?" Miss Marple whispered. "Not far, then." She turned as Craddock entered, his lantern cutting through the gloom. "You've found something, haven't you?" She pointed silently. When they dug, it didn't take long to find the body. Clara Whitmore lay beneath a shallow layer of soil, her wedding ring still on her finger, her veil tangled in her hair. Craddock cursed under his breath. The poor girl. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Love, Inspector, is sometimes the cruelest disguise of all." Julian Harrow denied everything, of course. He claimed Clara had run away and that someone else must have buried her, perhaps a deranged vagrant. But Miss Marple had already found the key, a faint trace of lavender oil under his fingernails, and fibers from the bride's veil caught on the cuff of his dinner jacket. "You see," she explained gently, "you chloroformed her, my dear Mr. Harrow, to make her quiet perhaps while you prepared to forge her farewell note. But you misjudged the dose. She died before you could make your fortune." His composure cracked. "You old witch, how could you possibly know that?" "Because," Miss Marple said, eyes bright, "I know men like you. You mistake silence for consent and death for escape." The trial made headlines for weeks. Harrow was convicted of murder, though he maintained his innocence to the very end. The papers dubbed Miss Marple the spinster who sees through love. She found the title rather tasteless. Weeks later, the manor was empty, the gardens overgrown. Miss Marple returned one afternoon, walking alone beneath the maple trees. She laid a small bunch of lilies on the soil near the shed and bowed her head. "Poor child," she murmured. "Some brides marry into happiness. Others marry into their graves." As she turned to leave, a single maple leaf drifted down, settling on the flowers like a quiet benediction. "Ah," Miss Marple whispered. "Heaven the trees remember." That evening, back at her cottage, she poured herself tea and gazed into the fire. Outside, the church bells chimed softly, the same bells that had rung for the wedding. "Love," she said to herself, "is not blind. It simply chooses to look away, until someone forces it to see." As she smiled faintly, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. "And another story," she murmured, "woven, mended and bound in truth." The October fog rolled thick and silent over St. Mary Mead, swallowing the hedgerows and softening the sound of church bells into a mournful hum. Most of the villagers hurried home early that week, whispering about lights in the windows of the long-abandoned glebe house. A place where, as children, they dared each other to peek through the broken gates and run away screaming. It was said that the ghost of Reverend Pritchard's wife, who died mysteriously 50 years ago, had returned to walk the halls, her pale figure appearing by the nursery window whenever the fog grew thickest. Naturally, Miss Marple didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in rumors, and rumors were often the shadows cast by truth. It was Mr. Clement, the vicar, who brought the matter to her attention over tea one morning. His wife, a practical woman with little patience for gossip, sat beside him rolling her eyes. "Miss Marple," said the vicar anxiously, "there have been disturbances." "Footsteps in the empty house," added Mrs. Clement, "and a flickering light in the nursery window every night this week. And last night," he whispered, "a scream. A woman's scream." Miss Marple stirred her tea calmly, and no one thought to look. "Well," the vicar admitted, "the villagers refuse to go near the place. It's been shut since the late Reverend's wife died. Fell down the stairs, they said. So many women seem to fall in these stories." Miss Marple murmured, "I often wonder whether gravity alone is to blame." That evening, as the fog thickened and the lamps in the village winked out one by one, Miss Marple took her shawl, her walking stick, and a small lantern, and walked toward Glebe House. The gate hung crooked on its hinges, the garden overrun with ivy and nettles. The great oak door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open, the sound echoing like a sigh. Inside, the air smelled of dust and decay. Her lantern flickered against the walls, revealing torn wallpaper, shattered furniture, and on the stairwell, a single footprint in the dust, fresh. "Ah," she murmured. "So our ghost wears boots, size 9. She made her way up the staircase, each step groaning beneath her weight. At the landing, a faint light glimmered from the nursery at the far end of the corridor. She approached slowly, every sense alert. The nursery door creaked open to reveal a strange sight, a lantern on the windowsill, glowing faintly through a thin veil of muslin. And beside it, a chair pulled up neatly, as though someone had been sitting there only moments ago. Then came the sound, not a scream but a cry muffled and desperate, from below. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She turned, descended the stairs, and followed the noise into the cellar. The air grew colder, damper. Her lantern flickered and went out. For a moment, she stood in darkness, listening. Then she heard it again, faint sobbing, coming from behind a pile of old crates. "Who's there?" she asked softly. The sobs stopped. Then a whisper. "Please, don't tell them I'm here." Miss Marple lifted her lantern again, and there, huddled in the corner, was a young woman in a torn cloak, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you look more frightened than any ghost could ever be." The girl's name was Emily Ward, and her story spilled out between trembling hands and gasping breaths. She had been a maid once, employed at a nearby estate. Her mistress had dismissed her abruptly, accusing her of theft. A pearl brooch gone missing. With no family, no money, and nowhere to go, Emily had hidden in Glebe House, where she believed no one would find her, but someone had. Someone who came at night, lighting the lamp in the nursery, searching for something. "He said he'd kill me if I told anyone," she whispered. "But I heard him upstairs last night, digging in the nursery floor." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Digging? For what, I wonder?" The next morning, Inspector Craddock arrived, summoned by Miss Marple's quiet note. "A ghost, it seems, prefers to dig by moonlight. Bring your spade." They went together to Glebe House. The nursery looked harmless in daylight, though the air was heavy with damp and mildew. The floorboards were uneven, and in one corner, the wood had been pried up. Craddock knelt, shining his torch. "Looks like someone's been at it recently." They pulled the boards aside, and there, beneath the floor, was a small iron box, rusted but intact. Inside were letters, tied neatly with a faded ribbon, and a pearl brooch glinting faintly in the dust. "Emily's brooch," Miss Marple said softly. "Or rather, her mistress's. So the real thief hid it here." Craddock frowned. "But who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The ghost who digs by night, my dear Inspector. And the man who owns the land surrounding this house. Mr. Arthur Blaine." Arthur Blaine was a wealthy land agent who had been lobbying to buy Glebe House for years. He'd claimed to want to preserve its historical value. But Miss Marple knew greed when she saw it. Blaine had access to the property, and a reason to hide his involvement. Years ago, he had been the Reverend's assistant, dismissed quietly after Mrs. Pritchard's fatal fall. Rumor had it she'd caught him stealing from church funds. He came back, Miss Marple explained, not for sentiment but for silence. The brooch must have been among his old loot, hidden here before he fled. When Emily took refuge in the same place, she became a witness he could not afford. Craddock nodded grimly. "And the ghost story kept everyone else away." "Quite so," Miss Marple said. "The best alibi is fear." That night, they laid a trap. Miss Marple insisted on keeping vigil in the nursery, knitting needles in hand, while Craddock waited below with 2 constables. The hours crawled by. The wind moaned through the cracks, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Then, near midnight, came the sound, a faint scraping of metal on wood. The latch turned slowly. Arthur Blaine stepped inside, holding a lantern and a crowbar. His eyes gleamed in the dim light as he moved toward the corner. "Looking for something, Mr. Blaine?" came a quiet voice behind him. He spun around. The old lady in the shawl stood calmly, her eyes bright as polished glass. "You," he hissed. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, just watching for ghosts," she said. "It seems one has appeared. And rather a clumsy one, too." He lunged toward her, but before he could reach her, Craddock burst through the door with his men. The lantern crashed to the floor, and the old wood flared briefly before the inspector stamped it out. Arthur Blaine was dragged away cursing, his hands cuffed, his fortune finished. The next day, Emily was cleared of all charges. The brooch returned to its rightful owner, who, shamed by her cruelty, offered the girl employment once more. But Emily declined politely. "I think," she said, "I've had enough of grand houses. I'd rather start somewhere honest." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Very wise choice, my dear. Ghosts tend to haunt wealth far more than poverty." A week later, the village returned to its calm rhythm. The fog lifted, the leaves turned gold, and the talk in the tea shop turned once more to gardens and recipes. But at night, when the wind blew from the hills, villagers still swore they saw a soft light glowing in the nursery window of Glebe House. They said it was the Reverend's wife, at peace now that the truth was out. Miss Marple, however, knew better. Sitting by her hearth, knitting in hand, she smiled faintly and whispered, "Ghosts don't linger where justice has been served. Only memories do." She glanced at the newspaper on her table. The headline read, "Arthur Blaine confesses to theft and murder plot, solved by elderly sleuth." With a sigh, she folded it neatly. "Such dreadful phrasing," she murmured. "Elderly sleuth indeed." Then she added, almost with amusement, "But I suppose even ghosts need their stories told." The clock chimed 10. The fog pressed softly against the window. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Another mystery ended," she said quietly. "And another soul freed, both the living and the dead." The summer sun shone golden on St. Mary Mead, turning every rose and ribbon into something bright enough to belong in a painting. The vicarage lawn was crowded with tables, bunting, and laughter. The annual garden party had begun. It was the event of the season, where the whole village came together to gossip politely over scones and lemonade. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair under the chestnut tree, her knitting needles clinking gently as she watched the bustle with quiet amusement. Nothing delighted her more than watching people pretend to be happy together. For that was when their true selves tended to slip through. The air was full of chatter. Mrs. Price Ridley boasting of her roses, Connell Melchett grumbling about taxes, and young Miss Hartley trying far too hard to catch the attention of Dr. Julian March, the new physician in town, handsome, intelligent, and, as the women whispered, delightfully unmarried. "He's far too smooth," Miss Marple said softly to herself, "and that sort of smoothness rarely stays that way for long." The afternoon unfolded peacefully, until the clock struck 3. At precisely that moment, a scream cut through the laughter. Cups clattered, a woman fainted, and Miss Marple, dropping her knitting, rose to her feet. The scream had come from behind the refreshment tent. A crowd gathered there within seconds, forming a tight circle around the figure lying face down in the grass. It was Dr. Julian March. A red stain bloomed across his white linen suit, a single gunshot to the chest. His right hand still clutched a teacup, now cracked and spilling amber liquid into the soil. "Good heavens," gasped Mrs. Clement. "The doctor's been shot."
"Shot!"
cried Colonel Melchett. "Here? In my village?" Miss Marple bent slowly, her expression grave but her eyes alert. "So it seems," she said softly. "And whoever did it, my dear Colonel, did not come for tea." By evening, Inspector Craddock had arrived. By now quite accustomed to finding Miss Marple already halfway through his job. "Miss Marple," he sighed, "I might as well hand you my badge."
"Oh, nonsense,"
she said briskly. "I'm simply observing. You're the one who does the proper work. Then observe away." He muttered, "Because I've got a dead doctor, 50 eyewitnesses, and not a single suspect who seems to know anything." Miss Marple began, as always, by noticing what others ignored. First, the teacup. It smelled faintly of almonds, cyanide, quick, bitter, unmistakable. Not the gun, then. The shot was a red herring. The bullet had grazed his shoulder. It was the poisoned tea that killed him. Second, the bullet itself. Embedded in the oak fence behind the tent. Fired, according to Craddock, from a small revolver found later in the shrubbery. "A theatrical distraction," Miss Marple murmured. "The kind of thing one plans to make the real murder invisible." Third, the note found in his jacket pocket. "You'll pay for what you did to her. Justice comes in time." The village was alive with theories by morning. Some said it was a jealous husband. Others swore it was a patient whose relative had died under his care. But Miss Marple, sitting at her window with a cup of cocoa, was remembering something Dr. March had said only last week while treating a child with a scraped knee. Poison is a coward's weapon, he'd remarked lightly. One that leaves no fingerprints, only regrets. Strange words for a man who would later die by the very same means. At breakfast, Miss Marple received a visit from Miss Hartley, her eyes red and swollen. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. They think I had something to do with it. Just because I fancied him." Miss Marple gave her a gentle look. "You cared for him deeply." "I thought I did," she said softly. "But he wasn't what he seemed. I found out he was writing to another woman, Mrs. Fanshawe, the widow who lives by the old mill." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "Ah, Mrs. Fanshawe, a woman with a past and no shortage of admirers. They said she used to be an actress," Miss Hartley whispered, "and I saw them quarreling behind the churchyard last Sunday." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "How observant of you, my dear." Later that day, Miss Marple paid a polite visit to Mrs. Fanshawe. The woman received her graciously, though her face was pale and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "Terrible business," she murmured. "Dr. March was a dear friend. Such a tragedy." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Indeed, you must be quite shaken." "I hardly knew him," she said too quickly. "How odd," Miss Marple said, "because I do believe your initials, L.F., were on the note found in his pocket." Mrs. Fanshawe's cup froze midair. "What note?" "Oh, I thought you'd have heard," Miss Marple said sweetly. "One rarely hides secrets well in a village, Mrs. Fanshawe, especially from its gardens." The widow set her cup down with trembling fingers. "He promised to help me," she whispered. "He said he could get back the money my late husband lost to that wretched investment scheme. But he was lying. He took what little I had left, and when I confronted him, he laughed." A tear welled in her eyes. "I hated him for it, but I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "I don't believe you did." That evening, Miss Marple sat knitting by her window, her mind sifting through threads of deceit, a poison cup, a fake shooting, a revenge note, a woman wronged but not murderous. It was all too neat, too arranged. Her eyes narrowed suddenly. The teacup again, handed to Dr. March not by a servant but by Colonel Melchett himself, who had insisted on serving the good doctor a cup fit for a hero. And Melchett's old army friend Mr. Briggs had provided the tea blend. Briggs, who had recently lost his daughter under Dr. March's care. The next morning Miss Marple asked to see the Colonel. He was in his study polishing his medals, looking more irritable than usual. "Miss Marple," he grunted, "if this is about that blasted doctor again." "It is," she said cheerfully. "You see, I believe he was killed twice. Once by poison, once by pride." The Colonel blinked. "What are you on about? You meant to frighten him," she said softly. "You planned the gunshot as a warning. But your friend Mr. Briggs had other ideas. He slipped the poison into the tea before you ever lifted the cup." Melchett turned pale. "Good God. You both wanted him to suffer." Miss Marple went on, "But for different reasons. You to humble his arrogance. Briggs to avenge his daughter's death. Neither of you realized you were working toward the same end, until it was too late." The Colonel sat heavily in his chair, his hands shaking. "How could you know that?" "Because," said Miss Marple gently, "guilt leaves the same shadow on every face, and you've been living in that shadow since yesterday afternoon." By evening, both men had confessed. Briggs had acquired the poison from his late daughter's medicine cabinet. Melchett, believing he was playing a harmless prank, had unwittingly served it to the victim. A tragic mistake, compounded by pride and grief. The following Sunday, the villagers gathered once more at the vicarage, not for a party this time, but for prayer. The air was heavy with remorse and reflection. Miss Marple sat quietly in her pew, her eyes thoughtful. After the service, Mrs. Clement approached her. "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple," she said softly. "You see everything others can't." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I simply notice what people don't wish to show. Murder, you see, rarely begins with violence. It begins with a small, ordinary lie." She looked across the churchyard, where sunlight filtered through the leaves. "And in a village," she added, "there is no lie small enough to stay hidden." That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The scent of roses drifted through the open window, and the laughter of children echoed from the green. For the first time in days the air felt peaceful again. "Poor Dr. March," she murmured. "He healed bodies but wounded hearts, and sometimes that proves the deadlier practice." Her needles clicked steadily, silver against the firelight. "But then," she smiled, "truth always has a way of finding its teacup." The wind that swept through St. Mary Mead that November morning carried with it the promise of change. the kind of sharp, cold breeze that whispers of endings. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, stood by her cottage window watching the fog drift across the village green. Her roses were long gone, replaced by brittle stems and fallen leaves. It was, she thought, the season when even secrets seemed to die, or perhaps when they decided to bloom one last time. A knock sounded on the door. When she opened it, Inspector Craddock stood there, his hat damp with rain and his expression unusually grave. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I'm afraid I've come with bad news. There's been another murder at Grantham Manor." Her brows rose. "The old Fairley estate?" "That's the one. Sir Lionel Fairley was found dead just inside the gates early this morning. Strangled, no sign of a struggle. The odd thing is, he had an envelope in his hand, addressed to you." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "To me." He handed her the envelope, the paper damp and creased. In a shaky scrawl it read, "To Miss Jane Marple, urgent and private." Inside was a short note, written in a trembling hand. "You were right, Miss Marple. It wasn't an accident. I've found proof. Meet me tonight at the gate. L.F." Miss Marple's heart tightened. L.F. Lucy Fairley, Sir Lionel's niece, a bright and courageous young woman who had once sought Miss Marple's advice about her uncle's suspicious affairs. "She's missing," Craddock said grimly. "No sign of her anywhere." That night, the fog thickened around Grantham Manor, turning its tall iron gates into dark, glistening bars against the moonlight. The house loomed behind them, ancient, cold, and quiet. Craddock and his men searched the grounds, but Miss Marple moved alone, her lantern swinging low as she followed her instincts toward the rose garden. There, beside the gate, the earth was freshly disturbed, a faint trail of footprints leading from the gravel path to the ivy-covered wall. She bent down, brushing the soil gently with her gloved fingers, and caught a glint of gold, a locket. Inside, a photograph of Lucy Fairley, and a folded scrap of paper that read, "The will, hidden in the library clock. He killed father for it. I have proof." Miss Marple closed her eyes. "Oh, my dear girl, you were brave, but far too alone." Inside the manor, Sir Lionel's study was as she remembered. Dark wood, heavy drapes, and the faint scent of cigars. His portrait hung above the fireplace, a stern face watching from the shadows. Craddock joined her quietly. "We've searched every inch of the place. No Lucy, no will, no fingerprints but his own." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the grand clock standing tall in the corner. Its pendulum swung lazily, ticking like a heart that refused to stop. "Not every inch, Inspector," she murmured. She opened the clock's front panel. Inside, behind the mechanism, lay a thin bundle of papers, a last will and testament signed and dated. It left everything not to Sir Lionel, but to Lucy Fairley. "He murdered his brother," Miss Marple said quietly, "and claimed the estate as his own. But Lucy discovered the truth, and he silenced her before she could reveal it." Craddock frowned. "Then where is she now?" Miss Marple turned toward the window. Beyond it, the iron gates gleamed faintly through the fog. "Still waiting for me, I think." By dawn, the mist began to lift. The constables dug near the gate, where Miss Marple had found the locket. Beneath a layer of wet leaves and soil they found her, Lucy Fairley, her pale face peaceful, her hand still clutching a torn piece of fabric from her uncle's coat. Inspector Craddock removed his hat, his expression heavy. "She died trying to reach you." Miss Marple's eyes glistened, though her voice was steady. "She wanted justice, Inspector. She will have it." That afternoon, Miss Marple sat once more in Sir Lionel's study, her knitting in her lap, as the servants whispered and policemen moved in and out of the hall. On the desk lay the will and a small book she had found tucked behind the clock. Sir Lionel's journal. The entries grew more erratic toward the end, filled with guilt and fear. "She knows. I can't let her tell. The gate, tonight. It must end there." Miss Marple closed the book gently. "So it did," she whispered. "But not as he planned." The trial was swift and merciless. Though Sir Lionel was already dead, the truth came to light years earlier. He had murdered his own brother to seize the family fortune, staging it as a riding accident. When Lucy uncovered the truth, he planned to kill her too. But she fought back, leaving evidence that exposed him after his death. Her bravery restored the estate to charity as she had wished. The village spoke of her as a martyr of justice, and Miss Marple ensured that her grave was always covered in white lilies, for purity of heart, she said simply. Weeks passed. Winter settled over St. Mary Mead. Snow dusted the hedges and rooftops, and even the robins seemed quieter that year. One evening, Inspector Craddock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. He found her by the fire, knitting something pale blue and smiling faintly at his knock. "Come in, Inspector. You look frozen to the bone." He accepted her tea gratefully. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple. The Fairley case, well, the papers are calling it your masterpiece." She chuckled softly. "Oh, how dreadful. I do wish they wouldn't use such silly words. There's no masterpiece in death, Inspector. Only lessons. You've certainly taught me a few, he admitted. But don't you ever tire of it all? The lies, the sorrow. Miss Marple looked into the fire. Once, perhaps. But you see, every lie uncovered is a life redeemed, even if only in memory. That's quite enough to keep one busy. As Craddock prepared to leave, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window. Miss Marple rose and pulled the curtain aside, gazing out at the dark road that wound toward the manor. Do you ever think, she asked softly, that evil doesn't vanish, Inspector? It only waits until someone looks away. Craddock followed her gaze. Then it's a good thing you never do. She smiled faintly. I'm old, my dear, not blind. He laughed, touched his hat, and stepped back into the storm. That night, alone once more, Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked around her quiet cottage. The clock ticked softly, the fire whispered low. Yet there was peace, the kind that comes only after truth has done its work. She reached for her teacup, took a small sip, and whispered into the stillness. Lucy, my dear, you've been avenged. May you rest easy now. Then, almost to herself, she added with a sigh, and may the rest of us never forget how fragile innocence truly is. Her eyes drifted to the window. The snow was falling thicker now, blanketing the world in white, as though trying to cover every trace of the pain it had witnessed. Perhaps, she murmured, that's the kindest thing nature ever does. It buries what we can't bear to see. The next morning, the villagers woke to find the world transformed. The manor, the green, the churchyard, all wrapped in soft, silent snow. And though life went on, they spoke for months of that final winter when Miss Marple uncovered her last and most haunting truth. In her cottage, the fire still burned, and the knitting lay folded neatly on the chair, unfinished but perfect in its pattern. A single note rested on the table beside it. In her delicate handwriting, truth is not the end of mystery, it is merely where kindness begins. Jane Marple,